Welcome to all of you who are welcome to all of you who are attending the 2026 celebration of Samson Occom Day. After having the opportunity to meet Mike Kelly a week ago in preparation for tonight, I can say without a doubt that this is going to be an excellent presentation. But before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to recognize my brother, former Brothertown council member and participant in past Samson Occom celebrations, Will Ottery. As many of you are aware, Will walked on June 6th of this year after a short illness.
Oh.
And I'm honored to have been asked by Council and Calumet Cross to be a part of tonight's Occom celebration. In preparation for memorial page for Will in the Summer Messenger newsletter, I started looking for an Occom quote, which I found, but which came from an entirely unexpected source. The quote was about Occom, not by him, and were the opening words of the 2026 documentary film, Forgotten Founder, the untold story of Samson Occom and Dartmouth. The words spoken by Beth Reagan, chairwoman of the Mohegan Council of Elders, grounded the entire film in the Native worldview in which the past and present coexist, with a quote establishing that the story of Samson Occom is not a static, dead biography, but a living, breathing legacy carried on by his modern descendants. The opening quote was, in Mohegan language, our ancestors are alive. We feel them, we know them. Occom is still with us. On the occasions of the Messenger in Memoriam and on the event of the 2026 Samson Occom Day celebration, I've taken the liberty of expanding the quote by the chairwoman as follows. In Mohegan language, our ancestors are alive. We feel them, we know them. Occom is still with us. As his descendant, scholar, and follower, Will is still with us. Will was a man with a plan, and I'm certain he would now be saying, Mike's waiting, let's get the show started. I'm sure you could all hear his voice. So as I mentioned before, I did have the opportunity to meet Mike last week, and it was a truly enjoyable Zoom call. Afterwards, he said that engaging with people who share my sense of curiosity is my happy place. So before he takes us to that happy place, let me tell you a few things about Mike Kelly. He's the head of archives and special collections at Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts, about 90 miles west of Boston. He oversees the school's collection of more than 80,000 rare books, along with a host of archival and manuscript collections. He is passionate about rare books and has worked in special collections for over 20 years. Mike spent 11 years as curator of books at the Fales Library and Special Collections at New York University before coming to Amherst in 2009. He held many positions within the rare books and manuscripts section of the American Library Association, including a term as chair in 2011 to 2012. He was also chair of the Racial History of Amherst College project from the time it was launched in 2020 until 2024. Earlier today, Mike was also teaching a course in the Rare Book School entitled Indigenous Agency, an Intervention in the Bibliographical Record, with Brandon Castle, who is a Native Studies librarian at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. The two of them worked together from 2021 until 2024 on the Mellon Grant Project, mapping Native intellectual networks of the Northeast, a grant that funded visits to local communities in New England to build relationships and confer with folks about the materials in the Amherst collection written by tribal members. Mike, I now turn it over to your capable hands.
Thank you very much. And I'm truly honored to be here. I want to do honor to your brother's memory and talk about a guy that I have gotten to know because I read his letters and his journals and his sermons. And I really do feel in relation with Samson Occom. So I have a slide presentation I'm going to give. Hopefully talk for about 20 minutes or so. But I really want to ask you guys to ask me questions and to share what I know and combine our knowledge together. So I really love talking to an audience when I don't have to explain who Samson Occom is. You guys know who he is. And he is a pretty amazing human being. This portrait of him is, so my background is, I know my specialty is the history of printing in England and America in the 18th and 19th centuries, how a book gets from an author's brain out into the public's hands. And starting with this, you're all very familiar with this image of Occam. And this print began as a painting that was done when he was in England in 1766. And from the painting, they made a print and they sold it. And it sold so well that I have found advertisements for this print for sale as late as 1794. So after, 30 years after he was in the country, his memory still resonated in England to the point where people would buy a print of this minister. My involvement and interest in Samson Occom begins back in 2013 when Amherst College hired a couple of Native Studies faculty, and there was already a good Native Studies program happening. We're right next door to UMass, University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where Kathleen Brown Perez is a professor who I've gotten to work with. So she was part of this whole Native Studies universe. And this bookseller had for sale the private collection of a man named Pablo Eisenberg, who had built a collection of books written by Native American authors. And, just to give you a sense, this is our neighborhood. This is Occam's neighborhood. Amherst College is in Nonotuck land. I'm talking to you from Nonotuck land. So where the Nonotuck name is in about the middle of this picture, that's where we are. And you can see down south is Mohegan and Montauk and Shinnecock. And these are all places that were important in Occam's life. So we purchased this collection because Amherst College has the means to purchase large collections of books. And this was the oldest item that we acquired. When we bought the collection of Pablo Eisenberg, my natural instinct was to look for what's the oldest thing? What's the earliest book in this collection? And this is a great example. This is what hooked my interest, because right on the title page, it tells you that, this is a sermon preached at the execution of Moses Paul, an Indian who was executed at New Haven on the 2nd of September, 1772. And further down the page, it says, this is the 4th edition. And at the very bottom of the page, it says it's still 1772. And an addition, to give you a really quick history of how printing works, we are still talking about what's known as the hand press period. And that means that somebody has to pick up a little piece of type that's in the upper left corner is a type case. Oh, and here's a great little tidbit for you. The small letters of the alphabet are kept in the case that's kind of low. And then there's a case that's higher up where the capital letters are. And that's where the terms uppercase and lowercase come from when we're talking about the alphabet. It's physically from the era when you had to pick up a piece of metal for each letter and lay it out on the press. And that's what's on the bottom left. That's what a page that is about to be printed looks like. And the picture on the right is a printing press from sometime in the 17th century, but that technology did not change. So in Occam's lifetime, someone still had to pick up every letter and put it on the press and then pull a handle to make that happen. And so an addition is you set out the type, you print a bunch of copies, and that's an addition. And then you put your type away, you use it to print something else, and then you run out of copies and you have to set the type again. And that costs money and time. And so when you see something that says there was a sermon given in September and they had to reprint it 4 times before the end of the year, that is very interesting. That tells you something. That tells you this is a very popular publication. And I want to back up. And before the sermon, of course, I have started to talk about this as not just the Samson Occom sermon, but the Moses Paul media event. Because Moses Paul, the guy who was executed, on December 7th, 1771, he kills Moses Cook outside of a bar in Connecticut. It's a bar fight, it's badly. This is a familiar story. And news of that murder and the trial and the plans for the execution and the execution is postponed, all of that appears in newspaper accounts throughout New England in the whole springtime of 1772, December 1771, autumn 1772. And I really want to make sure that we give credit to Moses Paul because he knew that when a native person is executed in New England, and usually almost when anyone is executed in New England, whoever preaches the sermon will then publish that sermon and that will be a source of fame and interest. And one of the most remarkable things in all of my research is the fact that this letter still exists. This is the letter that Moses Paul wrote to Samson Occom to invite him to preach the sermon at his execution. Several white ministers had come to New Haven where Moses Paul was in jail and said, "Oh, I'd love to preach your sermon." And he said no. And he knew exactly what he was doing when he said, "I'm going to invite the most famous Indian in North America to preach my sermon." Because by this time, this is 1772. By this time, Occom had been to England, very successfully raising money for what became Dartmouth College. He came home. He had a split with Eleazar Wheelock when Eleazar Wheelock said, "Thanks for raising all the money, Sam. Hey, how about instead of just native people, we open the college to everybody? How about instead of it being right next to Mohegan, we move it way up into the middle of New Hampshire?" And Occom was like, "Dude, I think we're done. I think we're done here." And so Moses Paul, I really want to give credit to him because to the moment of his execution, he insisted this was not a premeditated murder. This was self-defense. And I am going to make news about this. He knew the traditions of publishing a sermon around an execution, and he invited the best possible person, Samson Occom. And in my research, a lot of what I've been doing is looking for newspapers that report on the events and the publications. And it's kind of easy because in Connecticut in 1772, there were exactly 3 printing presses, and they were all owned by the same family. And so that kind of makes it a little, it's a very small pond that I'm fishing in. And so I was able to locate, you can see the newspaper on the left is published in New Haven. This is the New Haven newspaper by Thomas and Samuel Green. And it is dated October 30th, 1772. And it says, "Now in the press and next Monday will be published at the printing office in New Haven, the sermon by Samson Occom." And so this gives us an even smaller window. The first edition, that is what it looked like the first time it was printed, is that image on the right. It was printed in New Haven by Thomas and Samuel Green, who were the brothers of the guy who ran the press in New London. And so if it's the Monday after October 30th, it's November 2nd. So this is a really important piece of data because Occom writes in his preface, "It was a stormy and very uncomfortable day when the following discourse was delivered, and about half of it was not delivered as it was written, and now it is a little altered and enlarged in some places." So the Green family gave Occom 2 months to revise and expand what he wanted to say. And I always talk about this as he had sovereignty over his text. This is exactly what Sam Occom wanted on the page, because it would have been perfectly legal and fine for the Green brothers to stand in the crowd and write down what Occom said and then publish it. Instead, they gave him that space. And I think that's a really important indicator of the kind of relationship that he had with the Green brothers. Because the other important detail is that New London is a 9-mile walk from Mohegan. And I don't hopefully have to explain the whole Mason land case, that there was Connecticut, the Mohegan Nation in Connecticut sued the government over land rights. And that was a case that began before Occam was born and ended during his lifetime. But as the printing center, so the New London printer, Timothy Green, um, as the official printer to the Connecticut colony, is the first place that news would show up. So it's down the street from Mohegan. And if you want to know what the latest news from England is, you go to that printing shop. And so I am very confident that the entire Green family was very familiar with Samson Occom stopping by to see what was going on in the news. And so it really makes sense that after the New Haven publication of the sermon, the next time it is published is in New London by Timothy Green. And it really is. It's like these guys are brothers. Hey, we had this really great sermon that came out. I'll print it too. And so on November 13th, less than 10 days, or just about 10 days after the first printing of it in New Haven, here we have another ad for it. But this time, to which is added a short account of the life of said Moses Paul, and then the really important details. A few of the above sermons may be had of the Reverend Mr. Buell of East Hampton, Long Island, Mr. John Hulbert of Bridgehampton, Mr. Uriah Rogers of Southampton, and several post writers. So you guys might know that Occam spent a good decade on Long Island among the Montaukett. That's he married Mary Fowler of the Montauk Nation. And Reverend Buell is the guy who preached the sermon at Samson Occom's ordination. And so this is the title page from the ordination sermon. And so he is ordained in 1759. And there's, note the spelling of Samson Occom's name. It still has the U. But he was ordained in 1759, but oh no, it's cut off on the bottom. This printing didn't happen until it was in New York City in 1761. And this is where it's really important to understand how Occam was moving around, and that in 1761, he made a trip to Oneida, one of his early trips to Oneida. So this map shows his travel. He goes from Montauk to New London, Mohegan, and on to New York City. And it's in New York City in 1761 that he gets the ordination sermon printed, because 1761 is the middle of the French and Indian War. And so when he's going to Oneida, he's walking into a war zone, but he has with him a publication that says he is a Christian minister, and the sermon has testimonials to his character and his conduct. So this sort of functions as a pass. And so that is an important part. A lot of my work is about how Indigenous communities have interacted with print and how they've used printing as a mode of survival. And this is an example of that he can say, look, no, this is a book and it's about me. I'm okay. Let me pass. And so that's, and then Mr. Buell, the guy who preached that sermon, is one of the people who has copies of it for sale. And so it's really a network that he's plugged into. So if you wanted a copy of this sermon, you could get it because everybody was selling it. And the ad also says, to which is added a life of said Moses Paul. And so on the left, the first printing in New Haven ends with what I call the pool balls. So the sermon comes to an end, Occam says amen, and then that's the end of the publication. The second printing of it, the one that happens in New London a couple weeks later, has this whole biography of Moses Paul on the back. The source of that is a broadside that was printed in New Haven on the day that Moses Paul was executed. This is an image of violence against Native people. And I'm going to show a close-up in a minute, so just a warning to folks. But this is very unusual. In New England, when you have an execution, you get a sermon, and the sermon tells you how to understand that execution within the context of a Christian theocracy. In London, in the 18th century, executions were festivals. and Broadside Lives. It was the beginning of true crime literature. If anybody is a fan of reading true crime books, this is where it starts, is 18th century broadsides that told the exciting lives of the people about to be hanged for their terrible crimes. And in New Haven, like I have not found, and I have looked really hard, I have not found another day of execution broadside about anybody in North America. But this was an event, and I don't quite get what put this one into that special category, but the Thomas and Samuel Green of New Haven thought that this was a good idea, and so they published it. I'm going to show the close-up of the illustration at the top. This is a clearly racialized image, and this document, this broadside, exists in a single copy. There's only one of these known to exist. It's in New York City at the New York Historical Society. And so that bit of information about Moses Paul becomes attached to the sermon. It's not written by Samson Occom, but it gets stuck onto the end of his sermon from that point forward. Occom, of course, was traveling around New England quite a bit. He was preaching wherever he was needed. He was preaching to Native communities. He also frequently went to Boston. And so he goes to Boston in January of 1773, and guess what? They print copies of the sermon in Boston. And guess what? As it says at the top, just reprinted and to be sold by R. Draper in Newbury Street and J. Boyles in Marlborough Street, Richard Draper is married to the sister of Timothy, Thomas, and Samuel Green. And the frustrating thing about the 18th century is that we have a lot of documents, but we don't have all the documents. So we don't have any ledgers or letters or anything that talk about Occam's relationship with these printers. But I would be willing to bet that he comes up to Boston from New London, and Timothy Green in New London said, "Hey, go see my sister and her husband, and they'll print some copies of the sermon for you," because he's about to spend 2 weeks in Boston preaching. And this is a great example of how quickly they were, and not really very well printed copies. So if you look at that one on the far left, you can see how crooked the printing is on that page. And that, I think, speaks to the fact that here's a guy coming to town, he's giving a sermon, and people want to buy copies of it. Oh, geez, we ran out again. Print some more. Oh my gosh, we ran out again. Print some more. Quick, print some more. And this is my list so far, right? So the execution happens in New Haven, and there's the first edition, and then there's another edition, and then they print it in New London, and then they run out and they print it again, and they print it again, and then he goes to Boston, and they print it 1, 2, 3, like 8 times in Boston. And just know that every time they reprint it means they printed a bunch, they ran out, and they needed more. And so I am not going to get into the London printing or the 2 times it was translated into Welsh and published in Wales. But I want everyone to know that for some reason in 1789, somebody thought they could make money by printing Samuel Occam's sermon in the Welsh language. And I asked a book dealer, oh my gosh, it would be great if you could ever find us a copy of the 1789 Welsh edition of Occam's sermon. And he wrote back a few months later and said, well, I didn't find the 1789, but did you know there's an 1827 printing? And so down lower on the list, for some reason, they thought in 1827 in Wales? I mean, this guy has some reach. So I'll run through fairly quickly. There were many printings of it. And this also is a testimony to how much Occam was in the news in New England. And so in Salem, Massachusetts, they print an edition of the sermon in January of 1773. And there's an ad from the newspaper up at the top on the left. And on the right, they include news from Philadelphia. So if you look at the top of that, there's an extract of a letter from Philadelphia. Yesterday afternoon, the Reverend Samson Occom, minister of the gospel and missionary to his brother Indians, preached at the Presbyterian Meeting House in Long Lane, and likewise again at the same place in the evening to a very crowded auditory. So we've got Occam going as far south as Philadelphia and drawing big crowds. And I like to go to a lot of punk rock shows as a kid, and I really think this is thanks for coming out and hearing my sermon. You can get my merchandise at the back of the show on your way out, and he's got copies of the sermon for sale. I mean, I think that is literally true. He had relationships with these printers, and how can you sell some? You sell them after you have done a sermon and people want a souvenir. So it's also printed in Hartford. And I love in this newspaper ad for the sermon, that whole chunk at the bottom about how the honest simplicity and gospel sincerity that appears in the above sermon induced most families in this colony to purchase them. So this is a hit. He cannot print enough copies to keep people satisfied. He's got New Haven, New London, Boston printing a bunch, and there's still enough demand that Hartford and Salem printers feel the need to print some as well. And 1772, 1773, there's lots of editions of the sermon. And then in 1774, there's an advertisement in the New London paper for his hymnal. And first they say it's going to be a collection of poems. And then they say it's going to be a collection of hymns and spiritual songs in April of 1774. And then finally, they put out the collection of hymns and spiritual songs intended for the edification of sincere Christians of all denominations in New London by Timothy Green in 1774. And I think that date might resonate with this audience because 1774 is when they finalize the arrangement with the Oneida to establish the Brothertown community in Oneida territory. And I am convinced that the hymnal is something that he worked with Timothy Green to produce for that community. He talks all the time in his letters, in his diaries about how important music is. And so he uses the fame that he gets, for lack of a better term, the fame that he and the working with the printer to say what we really need for my community is a hymnal. And so Timothy Green works with him and they produce the hymnal. Another amazing moment in American literary history. So Phyllis Wheatley, who was enslaved by the Wheatley family in Boston, was also a poet. And when Samson Occom was preaching in Boston, where do you think he stayed? He stayed with the Wheatley family. And so here's one writer talking to another writer. Phyllis Wheatley's book of poetry is published in London, but distributed by Timothy Green in North America. And I think this ad is very important, and I don't think people have made enough of it. The fact that it says, to be sold by Timothy Green, poems on various subjects by Phyllis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley in Boston. A few of the above are likewise to be sold by Samson Occom. If you are reading this newspaper, you know who he is. We don't have to tell you his address. We don't have to tell you where to find him. It's like, oh, and if you see Samson Occom, he'll have some copies as well. So this interesting moment in American literary history where there's a native author who would have two of his own books, his sermon and his hymnal, as well as a book of poems by his friend Phyllis. And in Boston, in the city of Boston on Commonwealth Avenue, there's a statue of Phyllis Wheatley. And on the statue, it is her sitting at a desk writing something. And she is writing a letter to Samson Occom. And that letter became famous because it appeared in newspapers all over New England. The first newspaper it was printed in was Timothy Green's newspaper in New London, because Samson Occom went to Timothy Green and said, hey, my friend Phyllis sent me this letter. Maybe you should put it in the newspaper. Your uncle would have put it in the newspaper. Like, I really feel like he had that kind of relationship with these printers where he could say, like, yeah, you should put this in the paper. And they're like, sure thing, Mr. Occom. And that letter was picked up and reprinted many, many times. Um, this is one of my favorite bits. Um, a big part of my research was going to talk to Melissa Tantaquidgeon Zobel down at Mohegan. Um, and the first thing that we talked about was how Occom spelled his name. And she pointed out, if you're in Mohegan, Occom Lane is spelt with a U in Mohegan. Lucy Occom, the great Lucy of Mohegan, she spelt her last name with a U. Um, Almost every time the sermon is printed, Occam is spelt with an O, except this is the Northampton, Massachusetts, so about 5 miles that way from my house, printed in 1801 in Northampton. This is one of the only editions of the sermon that uses not just the OCCUM spelling of Occam, but also the Samson with a P. And that's what Melissa Zobel told me was this is important. The way that the spelling is done signals something. And I believe that this means there was a Mohegan person in the printing shop in Northampton who was setting the type for this sermon. And they thought, that's not how you spell Occam. And they just corrected it because they knew better. And that's how it went out of the printing shop. The other interesting detail is that the lower right image here on the screen is the tombstone of a woman named Sally Maminash. And she was a Mohegan woman who lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, and she dies in 1853, aged 88. So she was alive during Occam's time, and you can barely see it, but the third line, so Sally Maminash, last of her, the last Indian in this place. I forget what the second line says, but the third line says niece of Occam with a U. So people in Northampton, Massachusetts knew the name Samson Occom even as late as 1853. And so, of course, in 1801, they know it well enough that somebody in that print shop said, I know how to spell it better than those other people. This is how you spell Samson Occom. And that is a vital, I think that's just a fascinating detail. And even further, this is another page inside that 1801 Northampton edition. And, by this point, I'm sending Melissa Zobel just pictures of everything that I'm finding. I'm like, oh my God, look at this one. And she saw this image and she said, what are those diamonds? The medicine diamond is a symbol of our people. And she, referred me to one of her books, and there it is. Like Harold Tantaquidgeon built this is the Tantaquidgeon Museum that she's talking about here. He made his mark on the original building by carving a medicine diamond and placing it in the chimney. And so the odds of someone who's not Mohegan and doesn't know who Occam is deciding they're going to put diamonds all over this sermon is very low. I really do think that there was a Mohegan person in that print shop who made this happen. And it then gets reprinted multiple times. One of the things that I think is interesting, a lot of people talk about Occam as he's the first. He's the first native writer to have his own book under his own name. And that makes it sound like it happened once. But they kept printing his sermon. And I think this is fascinating that as time goes on, it gets printed further and further out. So these are the two New Hampshire editions. One is printed at Jaffrey, New Hampshire, and the other at Exeter, New Hampshire. I don't have really good understandings of why, but then it's printed in Bennington, Vermont. And this is a little confusing at first, but I think that I've figured it out. I've talked to a few people. When you would buy a bunch of type, when you're printing in the early 19th century, you would also buy a bunch of illustrations. And so you would get your typefaces, and this printer is sort of showing off. He's got some fancy looking type. These are the latest fashions in type for 1829. And that image is a figure known as a Mary Andrew. It is a stock illustration of sort of a harlequin figure from English lore. And I think it is the closest thing that this printer had to represent Indian. And if you look at sort of earlier representations in print of Native people, this is the best example that comes close. The idea of someone with like a feather and maybe doing a little dance. And so I think that was how the Bennington printer was trying to represent Indian. Um, and then things get a little unpleasant. And so now we're in Brothertown territory. We're in Oneida territory. This is a map that shows the path of the Erie Canal, which opened in 1825. We've really reached a different point in history. Occom has been dead for 30 years. And pressure of settlers coming into Oneida territory, coming to Brothertown territory, are only increased by the opening of the Erie Canal. And the canal comes right through Utica, skirts just north of Oneida territory, and goes into Oneida Lake. And the Utica printing press is the closest printing press to Brothertown at this point. This map of Oneida territory on the very lower right corner, just outside the blue line, you can see it says Brothertown. And you can also see all of these plots as settlers continue to pour into the territory. And so the pressure on Brothertown begins to mount. And the next image is a pretty disturbing one. And so I'm going to pause before I advance the slide. This is the 1829 edition of Occam's sermon that was printed in Utica, New York. And I don't think I need to say much about it. The fascinating thing is that the text of the sermon never changes. Everybody reprints the words that Occam wrote and that Occam wanted in print. But in 1829, right next door to Brothertown, they decided to put this image on the cover. And we are a long way from that print of Occam from England in 1768. And I will move off of that image. Putting together all of the dates and the places where we found printings of the sermon, the red dots are where it was printed during his lifetime. The yellow dots are where it was printed posthumously after he had passed. And it's a kind of a sad conclusion for me that his sermon goes from being extremely popular. Part of his message is that God's love is for everyone. God loves even the Negro and the white man and even us, the Tawny Indian. When you sin, we all go to the same hell. And yet, what the white printers did was try to flip that around and turn it into a warning against Native people. And with this group, you know that it was not long after 1829 that the Brothertown Nation decided to move away. But I want to end with some hope, because the same moment that last printing of Occam's sermon comes out, we also really begin to see the birth of a whole range of Native authorship, of Indigenous folks in the Northeast, especially using the printing press to get their own message out. And so while that is happening, while that Utica edition of 1829 is coming out, at the other side, in Tuscarora territory, at the other end of New York State, you have David Cusick publishing The Ancient History of the Six Nations. And there are two editions of that come out in 1827 and 1829. And then back down in New York City on the lower right, you get William Apis publishing the first autobiography by a Native person ever in print. And that is reprinted almost immediately because it's so popular. And so from this moment forward, we really do see a continuous presence of Native authorship, of people saying, I'm going to tell. Actually, what I love about Cusick is in his introduction, he says, I thought someone would have told the story of my people by now, and no one has, so I guess it's up to me. And he does it. And then other people do it. And then you get people like Copway, you get people like Boudinot, you get a steady stream of native authors who are using the printing press to push back and say, actually, I'm going to tell you our story. I'm going to tell you who we are, and I'm going to stop sharing now. And I hope that went okay. I'm happy to answer any questions folks have and hang out as long as y'all want to talk.
First of all, I will say that you lived up to my premonition that it was going to be an excellent talk. So thank you very much, Mike. And knowing that this is not a shy group of people, and there are people who love Occam and they know our history extremely well, I would expect there's going to be lots of really good questions. So live up to my prediction and none of you be shy.
Do we know how many issues of each sermon were printed?
The standard, nobody would print something and do less than 250 copies. Like that's kind of like baseline. So minimum 250 times, I think we're up to 26 different printings. But the other interesting thing, and it's funny that I keep forgetting this, when I'm looking at all the stuff happening in Boston in 1773, I sometimes forget, like, oh, right, the revolution. And so there might have been some shortages of paper, but still, it's not going to be worth it to print any fewer than 250 copies. So I think as a baseline, but also in the hand press period, you're probably not going to do more than 1,000. And so I would say if we average out to 500 times 26, that's a whole lot of copies. They were everywhere.
Could you put that in context with other authors and
Oh
sort of
yeah, no,
other?
he's I forget if it's third or fourth after, Thomas Paine, who published Common Sense, which was one of the best-selling pamphlets of the 1770s. Occam is in the top 10 books most frequently reprinted in the decade of the 1770s. This is a huge, I cannot overstate what a big thing this is. He's going from Boston to Philadelphia, and he's selling copies all along the way. And he is the most famous native person in North America at this time. So people are flocking to see him. Every newspaper account of the original delivery of the sermon says there was a significant number of native people in attendance. And so he's reaching a lot. I really think in terms of how people communicated in the 1770s, he's at the top. There really aren't that many. I mean, the other things that are in the top 10 are like big revolutionary pamphlets like Common Sense. And so the fact that this sermon gets in that, is rated that high, is just, no, he's the bomb. There's no doubt about that.
Mike, any idea what incidence there is of typographical errors? And has anybody found any of them that are significant in terms of either the meaning or the interpretation of the sermon?
No, I really strained my eyes, looking very, very carefully and reading the sermon backwards and forwards so many times. One issue is there aren't that many copies. So I have seen all of the copies of the first printing that are known to exist. And I think there's like 4. And so I've looked through it all. The only time that the text of the sermon changes is when it's printed in London. And that is just a very strange sort of side quest that happens. And whoever was publishing it in London thought they wanted to insert themselves. And so there's this guy, the editor of the London edition sort of makes up this little narrative, and he takes parts of the preface and he makes it like it's his own language. But that was completely separate. In North America, every copy is the same. They don't change the text. And that's what I find fascinating. And it also made it difficult to make sure that these were different settings of the type, because it's pretty clear that everybody has a copy of the printed sermon that they're using to print a new copy of the sermon. And so it is a remarkably, what we would call in bibliography, a stable text. And that,
What's even more impressive is the fact that that was typeset.
yeah.
To have that few errors when it's literally done letter by letter is really says something about the respect for maintaining the integrity of the book.
Well, and that's one of the elements of that Northampton edition of 1801 is that it looks great. Like somebody took care for that. I think in Boston, what I've seen is they're just trying to get them out really fast, and they do it pretty well. The other aspect of the Boston printings is that Richard Draper and his wife, who's the sister of the Greens, they were loyalists. And in 1773, a loyalist printer was desperate for something that didn't have anything to do with politics that they could publish and make some money from. So I think that is part of, our sister could probably really use a hand right now. She could reprint this and it'll do pretty well. She ends up going back to England. He dies. Richard Draper dies, and his wife, who's one of the Greens, ends up running the print shop until she can get back to England. I've spent a lot of time looking at the genealogy of the Green family. It's the whole other thing. But the other thing that I didn't bring up that I do think is worth mentioning is we do have evidence of other Mohegan preachers reading Samson Occom's sermon to other Native communities. And so there's Joseph Johnson Jr., who in his diary writes about arriving at Farmington to preach to the Indians there, and I read to them from Occom's sermon. And so we know that this had a circulation within Native communities, and that it was valued and treasured by Native communities, and it had a life that continues today. I mean, I think that's the great part. Other questions?
You mentioned Occom would have taken the sermons, copies of the sermon, and sold them.
Yep.
Do you think Johnson would have done the same? Would Occom send him off with some copies to sell, or no?
Probably. I mean, one of the interesting things about book selling in the colonial period is in England, you have London is where all the books are printed and they send them out and they have distribution networks. In North America, if Timothy Green had someone he trusted who could take a bunch of copies of a book out and sell them, he would do that. It was very much... one of the ads also talks about post riders. And so the guy who's running the mail from, New London up to Boston twice a week, here, take some copies of this sermon and you might sell them on the way. And so I think that's a very common, the whole thing about having copies of Phyllis Wheatley's book, it would be, hey, Samson Occom, what books do you have? It's like, oh, I've got my sermon, I've got my hymnal, I've got Phyllis's book. It's really I want to say it's the Wild West, but that's probably not the right term for it. But it is a chaotic time in publishing and printing. And a thing to keep in mind, one of my book history professors really, just impressed upon us that no one ever prints a book if they don't think they can make some money. And so people knew that, wow, this Occom guy is a hit. Let's keep printing the sermon and people will keep buying it. And however we can distribute it is how we'll distribute it. Yeah.
Do you think that that's the reason why the images change? Why they go away from just being his face to being more salacious?
Yeah, there was an Amherst student that I was talking to about, I gave a presentation like this to one of the students, and one of the guys said, oh, those people, there was no one around by 1829. There probably weren't that many people around to say, hey, that's not what he looked like. And so I think it goes away from the specificity of he's a human being that you might see in reality to, oh, he's some Indian who made a sermon. And obviously it becomes this colonial push, right? That we are going to portray Native people as cartoons. We are going to portray Samson Occom as someone in a grass skirt, when the real dominant image that most people who were alive during his lifetime would have known is, no, he's an actual preacher. He was famous. He was respected. And it's almost like the media manipulates things to make people believe stuff that's not true. I mean, this is America. Sorry. I'm going to get a little punchy this late. But I think that's really it. They're like, all right, we're going to take your sincere description of, God's love for all people and just make sure that you know that we don't want you here. And it really is like the cover of that 1829 edition is just a slap in the face to the Brothertown nation. But Bradley, did you have a question?
Yes. And first, I just want to say this was really fantastic. So thank you, Mike, for sharing all this with us. I think obviously the Welsh translations are really interesting. I wanted to ask if do you suspect that you'll find other translations in other languages, or do you think that that's like a
Oh,
special exception? Like, how many
man.
more versions do you think there might be?
Oh, I wish. I really wish. Like, I would love to find it like translated into Cherokee or something. I think that would be awesome. No, the thing that really kind of sank my heart was when I was talking to a British scholar, and they said that's probably the result of some weird fight within the Church of England and people in Wales. What we suspect, and this is talking with as many people as I could about this, the idea is that maybe because Wales is like Ireland, is a colony of the English. The English colonized Wales, the Welsh. And they might have been trying to make a point by saying, we'll print a good Christian sermon, but it's not by somebody from England, and it's not by somebody even from Europe. This is a native guy. And so I think that might have been the motive behind it. And I'm kind of encouraged by the more I've looked, some of the first anti-slavery poetry, some of the first abolitionist publishing happens in Wales. And so that's like a whole other thing. But also, it's all in Welsh. And Welsh is like, I hit a wall. I really hit a wall. But I did figure out that the Welsh edition of the sermon was printed by the number one best publisher of Welsh language publishing in Wales in 1789. Why it comes out again in 1827, I cannot even fathom. I mean, that's just weird. Which, to get all technical, that's just kind of weird. But it's fascinating. And if a library has a copy of Occam's sermon, it is most likely the 1788 London printing, because I think that had the biggest print run of any of them. And actually, Amy, if you want to walk over to the Houghton Library, they have the copy of the New Haven edition of Occam's sermon that was marked up to set the type for the London edition. Because I went to Houghton, I was like, I want to see all your Occam sermon, and they bring them out, and I start looking at it. It's like, this one has marks all over it. What? Wait a minute. And then I pulled up my images of the London edition, and everything that was crossed out in this copy at Houghton is missing from it. Like, this is the copy the editor used. And there's even math on the very back page that says how many sheets of paper they're going to need to print it. And I guess this is another point. This is one of my last, I say it's my last point. Occam was very collectible, like during his lifetime. So somebody thought, wow, I have this copy of Occam's sermon. I'm going to send it to Harvard. I think the Clements Library at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor has Occam's copy of the 1663 Massachusetts Language Bible. And the reason his journals survive and the reason his letters survive is because people thought, wow, this guy is really special. I'm going to hang on to this. And I love to think about Reverend Buell, who clearly loved the guy, spoke at his ordination, gave that sermon, and then sold copies of Occam's sermon. Like there's a community in here and there's networks in here that are really special in the history of American literature and the history of American publishing, in Mohegan and Brothertown history. Can you tell I kind of like the guy?
Mike, one of the things that you and I talked about last week, I kind of kiddingly, I probably shouldn't say this, but I kiddingly said, "So when are you going to write your book about this?" And you said that interesting. Your
Mhm.
boss has been after you a bit, and that you
Yeah, he
worked
said
at
the
it.
same
So
thing. Yep.
I'm going to give you a tidbit of why that might be a really good idea. You might all of a sudden get things coming out of the woodwork
Yeah.
that are opportunities. So maybe it's goes beyond Welsh and may go to other
Oh,
places that come out of the woodwork that you might not have any idea about, which is a great opportunity because I think the way you speak and the way you love this whole topic, I think would come across in the book. So if you do it, that might be another motivation besides
I
your boss saying anything to actually have it done.
this I know what I have to do. I owe it. I owe it to him. I owe it to him. I owe it to you guys. I owe it to Mohegan. Um, yeah. Stay tuned.
And we've
Stay
we've
tuned.
got our vice chair on. I don't. We may have other council people on, but I saw our vice chair on at one point, and I told him if he does this, Jessica, that we'd invite him out to Wisconsin and he could do a presentation
Oh, come.
at our cultural
Absolutely.
center, our community center, and make it an important part of our heritage that's living, just as the film said, he is among us, and it is not a static thing. It's a living
Yeah.
heritage.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I
Thank
went
you.
off camera. I was listening, but I was digging for my copy of the sermon. I have an original copy. I'm like, which one do I have?
Oh,
I have to
nice.
find out which
Send
one
me
I
a picture. Send me a picture. Yeah, like I bet how many households have held on to a copy of that sermon, right? How many families have passed it down?
Yeah, I had no idea. So you just like sparked something for me to like get
Mhm.
to the bottom of it. So
Yeah. And it's great.
yeah,
It's a good read.
yeah.
I think all of us have heard of the sermon, but I don't think any of us. I certainly didn't until I started reading it before I met you, Mike.
Hmm.
That what was the legacy of this book and how many editions had been done. I thought it was
Yeah,
you gave such insight in a way that I don't think probably any of us had any concept
thank you.
of
Yeah, no,
what
it
the
was
depth and breadth of this was.
almost continuously in print for like 30 years after he dies. That's that's a testament to something. Um, and here we are in 2026 still talking about it. All
I don't know
right.
if there's a better way to celebrate Samson Occom. This was fantastic. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to Wisconsin. Everyone is also welcome to come over to Amherst anytime you want. We'll show you Occam's sermon. We'll show you 4,000 other books written by Native people, ranging from 1772 until yesterday. I'm really excited that we are working with Lee Francis, who is Pueblo Laguna, and he is curating an exhibit we have the Eric Carle Children's Illustration Book Museum here. He's doing from January to June of next year, all Native children's books illustrator exhibition. And we at Amherst will be doing a complimentary exhibit of all Native comic books. And that's a pretty happy place too. So we're doing it from, it's not just the past, it's the present, and it's the future. So
I have a question, Sherry. You always have really good comments and insights, and you've been off site for a lot, but your face is now showing. So do you have any observations, Sherry, in terms of anything you'd like to add? Because you always have such great insights.
You're on
You're on
mute.
mute.
I've just really enjoyed the presentation tonight. I mean, I had no idea of all of these printings and how long it went on. And so this is really all new information to me. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's the sharing it. I don't need to know it just for myself. I know it to share with people. And so I mean, honestly, this is who it's for. This is the audience. This is the perfect audience.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really happy to be part of Samson Occom.
So we took you to your happy place.
Yes, you did. Now I have a little dog that needs to go outside to her happy place. And she's been,
Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Mike.
All right. Thank you very much.
Excellent.
I'll be in touch.
Thanks,
You know where to
everyone.
find me.
Thank
All right.
you. That was
Bye-bye.
great. Thank you.
Putney.
Have a good night.
Good to see you all.
Bye.